Dragon's Dogma II, one of the most looked forward to releases of the year, and one that I honestly didn't expect to be super controversial. Boy oh boy was I off the mark on that. Hey guys, Jarbo Gaming here, and welcome to the first of a new series of reviews that I'm dubbing Dad Reviews. We'll dive into games, offering the usual subjective opinions, but also look at a few key elements that determine whether a game is dad gamer friendly. Things like having the ability to pause or save your gameplay at any time, cost of time investment, pickup and playability, and more. Because things change when you become a gamer dad. I would know. Day after day of countless hours of gaming turns into carefully cut out chunks of precious hours here and there, with the added bonus of potential interruptions when your precious little angel decides to wake up. Fun stuff. You want to make the most out of those few and far between chunks of time and play games that are truly worthy of your while. I intend to help you do just that. So, without further ado, let's dive on in. Between performance issues and the addition of microtransactions upon release, some people are flat out upset with Dragon's Dogma II, and its current mixed status on Steam shows it. Right up front, I'd like to say I'm not a fan of microtransactions, especially in full-price single-player games. In free-to-play games, sure, the game needs to be funded somehow, but in games like this, I think it's a sign of scummy corporate greed. But I don't think microtransactions like this should come as a surprise in a Capcom game. I mean, just look at Devil May Cry 5's store page. It's a very similar situation, and yet the game has overwhelmingly positive reviews. The microtransactions offered here have no impact on your ability to play and enjoy the game, and after looking through them, the majority of items are things you can easily obtain in-game, and I honestly have no idea why anyone would buy any of these. There's a ton of other much larger content creators out there that have gone into the specifics of these, and I don't really want to drag on about them, but TLDR, the microtransactions are bad, you don't need them, don't buy them, they offer essentially no benefit and are pointless. End of story. Now, performance. That's something truly worth being upset over in my opinion. The game has some of the largest swings in frame rate throughout gameplay that I've ever seen. I'm running a 6900 XT alongside a 5800X 3D at 1440p, not an absolute top of the line system by any means, but also not too bad either. I see pretty great frames when out in the wilderness exploring and fighting monsters, easily pushing past 60 with all the settings cranked up and FSR set to the quality preset, but once I get to town, particularly the main city in the beginning of the game, frames drop to the 30s and 40s. This doesn't make the game unplayable. Thankfully, almost all combat happens outside city or town limits with a few exceptions, but it certainly is an issue. It's actually been addressed by the developers, as they were quoted saying, "In Dragon's Dogma II, a large amount of CPU usage is allocated to each character and dynamically calculates the impact of their physical presence in various environments. In certain situations where numerous characters appear simultaneously, the CPU usage can be very high and may affect the frame rate. We are aware that in such situations, settings that reduce GPU load may currently have a limited effect, however, we're looking into ways to improve performance in the future. We can only hope that there actually is something that can be done to improve optimization in some way, but until any improvements are actually implemented, it's worth evaluating your PC specs to make sure you'll be able to run the game at a frame rate you're comfortable with." Update. So while in the process of making this video, a patch dropped that, among other things, like the ability to start a new game, which is something I also bring up later in the video that was missing from the game at release, seems to have improved performance, particularly in cities. I'm not sure exactly what was done, but my frame rate is definitely improved, going from the 30s and 40s to the 50s and higher while in town. This is really nice to see, and I'm glad to see that some improvements are already being made. Moving on from the primary issues, let's talk about the game itself. Is this one that should be on your radar, despite the controversy? Well, if the idea of a massive open-world ARPG with fun, engaging combat appeals to you, then yes, absolutely. Now, as of the time of writing, I'm about 30 hours into my run-through, but I can already tell this is one of those games that has the potential for you to easily sink 100 plus hours into it. There's a lot to do. Combat is satisfying, with each different vocation or class that's available to the player to switch to and from, feeling incredibly unique in their own rights. I started off my playthrough as a thief, which perfectly fulfills the rogue fantasy. Being able to quickly dart around between enemies, climb huge foes, and deliver massive damage while dual-wielding blades makes for some really fun gameplay. But I eventually decided to give the warrior a try, and man, it almost felt like playing a different game. Going from the quick, nimble, and precise strikes of my thief to the deliberate, slow, and heavy blows of the warrior is something that not only mixes gameplay up to make it feel fresh, which, by the way, there are 10 total vocations to choose from, it also benefits the other vocations I play, because by playing and leveling up each vocation, you unlock augments, which are passive abilities that can be applied to your character regardless of what vocation you're using. So this means that since I've unlocked the Vigor augment on my thief, which makes it so that less stamina is consumed when I'm clinging to big enemies, I can now use that augment on my warrior in the same way that when I unlock augments on my warrior, I can equip and use them on my thief or any other vocation that I choose to use for that matter. I really like this system as it encourages you to switch things up every now and then, and there's actually some real benefit to it. Who knows, you might just switch to something else and discover that you vastly prefer it to what you started the game with. Now, I will say that it took a couple of hours for the combat to click for me, mostly due to the game not having the traditional lock-on to enemy system that you sort of expect to find in a third-person ARPG. Once I got used to the camera speed though, and just overall had more time with the game, I sort of forgot that the feature wasn't implemented and didn't really miss it, which I didn't expect. Combat initially could feel a little unforgiving. You know that thing in some games where enemies will have you surrounded, but sort of only attack you one at a time, so even though you're surrounded, the fight stays fair? Yeah, that doesn't happen here. If you push into a group of enemies, even lesser ones for that matter, they can surround you, knock you down, and proceed to just wail on you, inflicting serious damage. Fortunately, you don't go into this adventure alone. Perhaps what makes this open-world ARPG stand out the most is the pawn system. At the start of the game, after using the robust character creator tool to create your own main character, you do the same for a main pawn. This main pawn becomes your sort of ultimate travel companion, sticking to your side throughout the game, doing damage, tanking, or healing for you depending on how you set them up. And just like your main character, you can swap their vocation around at will, change their equipped skills, augments, and more. In addition to your main pawn, you also get to add 2 other pawns to your party. As you're out exploring the world, you'll constantly encounter other pawns that are hireable and also find rift stones, which allow you to summon and sort of shop for pawns to hire. You can even filter them down by specific criteria, like class or skills equipped, which really helps you find exactly what you're looking for in a party member. These hireable pawns you have access to are the main pawns of other players, and even though the game isn't multiplayer in the conventional sense, you're still able to interact with other players by sending gifts back to them with their pawns when you dismiss them. You can also give a thumbs up or heart rating to show your appreciation. Pawns really breathe life into your adventure as they accompany you out into the wilds, providing back and forth banter, assistance in combat, guidance, and more. You see, pawns gain knowledge of the adventures they take part in while in other players' worlds. Sometimes they'll have knowledge of a quest you're on and be able to guide you directly where you need to go, or they might be able to point you to the location of a treasure chest or cave you've yet to discover. Overall, I found the pawn system to be really well done. And yes, while every now and then you'll hear the same voice line repeated, it really isn't that bad, and to my surprise, from time to time, I'm still hearing new lines of banter that I've yet to hear. Their inclusion really helps fulfill the almost D&D-like fantasy of venturing forth with your companions to take on the world, together. Before we move on to a more in-detail look at gameplay, including a few key elements that might make this game a great pickup for all the gamer dads out there, I'd like to briefly touch on story. For the purpose of avoiding spoilers for those who are still on the fence on this one, I'll keep this brief. You take on the role of the Arisen, a character who has had his heart plucked out and eaten by a rather imposing dragon. With the power to create and command pawns, the Arisen is revered in the world of Dragon's Dogma, sort of like royalty, as there can only ever be one at any given time. Much to our surprise, early on, we learn there's another claiming to be Arisen sitting on the throne, and not just in appearance either. He appears to display qualities that could only be possessed by a true Arisen. Fortunately for us, the captain of the guard recognizes us for who we truly are and offers to help uncover the mystery of what's actually going on. The main story unfolds from there, and you, as the player, can choose to progress it at a rate that you see fit, whether that be focusing primarily on completing it or doing loads of exploration and side quests along the way, of which there are tons offered in the world. Alright, let's move on to gameplay and what it's like. From the moment you're set loose into the vast open world, one thing that persists is the freedom to do whatever the hell you want. If you're the type of person that likes to just kick back with a couple free hours and hop into an ARPG with no real objectives other than discovering what a vast open world has to offer you, you're gonna love this. While there are some side quests that are timed, it's pretty easy to tell that when they're being offered to you, and if you're not up for that kind of thing at the moment, you can simply decline. Choosing to head off into some unexplored portion of the map and seeing what you can find is a rewarded playstyle here, with the potential to find caves, treasures, rare items, bosses, and more. The actual gameplay loop involved in a playstyle like this is really well done in my opinion, and gives me vibes similar to those that I felt when I first jumped into the open world of Skyrim. While you make your trek across the landscape, you'll encounter enemies ranging from small packs of goblins or bandits to larger, much more dangerous foes. As you go from encounter to encounter, eventually your health will start to diminish. You see, damage in this game works like this. As you take damage, you lose permanent chunks of your health bar that can't be healed by a mage or consumables. Eventually, you get to the point where you may be missing a third or even more of your health bar. Fully recovering these missing health chunks requires resting, which can be done at an inn or campsite. While you're out exploring, you'll run into a good amount of these campsites. There may be enemies around them sometimes, but once cleared, you can set up camp, cook yourself a delicious steak you've claimed from some beast, and sleep through the night until the morning. Which, yeah, the game has a day and night cycle, and it's best to stick to the daylight hours when you're out in the wilds, especially when you're first starting your journey. Once the sun goes down, things can get much more dangerous. New types of enemies can appear and visibility is drastically reduced. Dark is definitely dark in this game, and your lantern can only cast light so far. But in the same way that getting caught out after nightfall can be a terrifying experience, it can also provide memorable ones as well. Catching a glimpse of the embers of a glowing campfire through the trees while frantically trying to find a place to rest through the night to recover a dwindling HP bar is something I won't soon forget. And we briefly touched on combat earlier, but it's worth mentioning again here because as you're out exploring the world, there's going to be a ton of it. It seems like groups of enemies lie practically around every corner, and depending on if you actually enjoy the feel of combat or not, you're either going to love this or hate it. On one hand, I could see how someone may be annoyed with how it can sort of drag out how long it takes to move across the map, and enemies do respawn after some time as well, so they're essentially always going to be in the same spots they were in the last time you moved through an area. On the other hand, if you enjoy the combat system, you'll welcome these enemies as they offer experience, gold, loot, and just combat in general. Personally, I looked at every enemy as a potential contribution to leveling up my vocations. They were also a good gauge on just how much my party had grown, both in level and skill, as my journey continued. Making quick work of groups of smaller enemies that may have given me trouble before really helped contribute to the power fantasy of growing stronger as my journey continued, and to a much larger extent, the same applied to the bigger, more powerful enemies. Encounters with these much more intimidating foes are what really make the combat here stand apart from other more traditional open-world ARPGs. Enemies like what you're seeing on screen take much more damage to take down than standard enemies, and it just feels right. The feeling of finally finding success against the Griffin after failing twice beforehand, not long after I started my journey, was an incredible feeling, even if I did have a little help from some guards. In that moment, this creature went from something to fear to something I could kill. And in the same way encountering smaller groups of enemies got easier as I became more powerful, the same applied to the larger monsters. The more I progressed, the more I welcomed the sight of ogres, cyclops, and the other large beasts one encounters out in the world. Like going from being the prey to the hunter. I'll say it again. Power fantasy. I really started to feel like there was nothing my party and I couldn't accomplish together. No foe too strong to conquer. Dragon's Dogma II conveys this feeling to you in an almost unparalleled fashion. Now, if all of what I just said appeals to you, this may be something you want to pick up, and hell, you'll probably love it. But if for whatever reason the combat doesn't click and you don't enjoy it, you might think the game feels a bit like a chore. If you're looking for a narrative-driven, cinematic story experience to kick back to play and relax to when you finally get some time away from the kiddo, this might not be the game for you. I'm not saying the game doesn't have any of that, but it's definitely focused more on combat above all else. With the amount of trekking you do back and forth across the map and the much smaller amount of fast traveling compared to other games in the genre, you may get the feeling that the game is artificially extending itself and not respecting your time. This game is very much about the journey, not the destination, and if you don't enjoy that journey, you might not be a fan of it. That's not to say you have to run everywhere. There is a fast travel system in the game that uses a consumable item called fairy stones, it's just that your use of that system is somewhat limited. There are also ox carts that can be used to go from city to city, which is essentially fast travel, but if you don't have access to one of those to get to your destination, you're going to be running. Also, if you're the type of person who likes to quick save before every encounter or have multiple save files at different parts of a game to fall back to, this one's going to be an adjustment for you. There's no quick save function and only one save slot. Now, you can pause gameplay at any time to perform a manual save and continue as long as you aren't in combat, but that's pretty much all you get. As far as whether or not the game is worth its full price of $70, well, personally, I feel if you have the spare money to spend, this one's worth it. You could easily sink tons of hours in across multiple playthroughs, especially if you're the type of person who likes to find and explore everything in games like this. With 3 possible different endings to obtain, if you really fall in love with it, you may find yourself playing through at least 3 times. Yes, $70 is a lot, but consider this. Back in the Nintendo 64 era, games were commonly sold at the $50 or more price point, which is the equivalent of a whopping $95 today. Ultimately though, the decision to purchase is up to you and your personal finances, and is a decision that shouldn't be taken lightly. After all, that money could just about cover the cost of a pack of diapers and wipes. Even as I'm writing this, I'm already itching to get back in game and uncover parts of the world that I've yet to see. There's still so much of the map I've yet to uncover, and so many quests left to complete. I may even give a brand new vocation a try. Despite the controversy, Dragon's Dogma II is a fantastic game, and I wouldn't let other people's opinions sway you from getting to experience it. Will it win Game of the Year? Probably not. The gameplay and design choices may not appeal to everyone out there, but you know what? That's okay. Not every game needs to be enjoyed by everyone. If you tried to make a game that's only objective was to appeal to the vast majority of audiences, you'd never get a game like Dragon's Dogma 2. But what are your thoughts on the game? What's your favorite vocation? Your least favorite enemy type? How's the performance on your system? Let me know down below. This is Jarbo Gaming. As always, thank you so much for watching. We'll see you on the next one.